Welcome, dreamers, to the Sleepy Mythologist, where the ancient world whispers to you as you rest. Tonight, we journey to the sacred mountains of Japan, where light once vanished from the world. This is the tale of Amaterasu, the Japanese sun goddess, who once hid away in a cave, plunging the world into eternal night. But why did she disappear? What drove the source of all light to retreat into darkness? Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you watching from tonight? I'd love to know where this story is reaching you. Let us drift gently through the mist of legend as the gods of old reveal their secrets. In the very beginning, before the mountains stood tall or the rivers carved their way through the earth, before even the first cherry blossom danced on the spring breeze, there was nothing but swirling chaos, a vast, undefined emptiness, neither light nor dark, neither sun, sky, nor sea. It was the age before time where form and formlessness were one. From this great void, slowly, the first divine beings began to emerge. They were known as the Koto Amatsukami, the separate heavenly deities, so distant and mysterious that they soon faded from the world. But from their fading presence came two powerful kami, two sibling deities destined to shape the land and life of Japan itself. Izanagi no Mikoto and Izanami no Mikoto. They were brother and sister, husband and wife, divine creators formed by the will of the heavens. As the celestial mist cleared, these two kami stood on the floating bridge of heaven, gazing down upon the chaos below. It was empty and formless, but full of possibility. The gods of the heavens gave them a sacred task, to bring order to the world and to give shape to the land. Izanagi held in his hands the Amino Nuboko, the heavenly jewelled spear. Together they dipped the spear into the endless ocean of chaos and stirred. As they pulled the spear back, salty drops fell from its tip and began to harden, forming the first island, Onogoro Shima. It was here, upon this sacred landmass, that the divine pair descended to begin the great work of creation. On Onogoro, Izanagi and Izanami performed a marriage ritual, walking in opposite directions around a heavenly pillar. But their first attempt ended in failure, for the woman had spoken first, something the gods found improper. They tried again, this time in the correct way, and their union was blessed. From this divine marriage came the islands of Japan, born one by one from their union. Honshu, Shikoku, Kyushu, and many others, each carrying the sacred essence of its creators. But their task was not yet complete. Izanagi and Izanami began creating the forces of nature, birthing the gods of wind, trees, mountains, rivers, and fire. Each new kami was a part of the world itself, woven into the fabric of existence. Yet with the birth of the fire god, Kagutsuchi, tragedy struck. Izanami was fatally burned in childbirth and descended to Yomi, the shadowy land of the dead. Stricken with grief, Izanagi journeyed to Yomi in an attempt to retrieve her. But what he saw there filled him with horror. Izanami, once radiant, had become a decaying form bound to the underworld. When she begged him not to look upon her, and he disobeyed, a terrible curse was set in motion. Izanami vowed to take 1,000 lives each day, and Izanagi responded that he would create 1,500 more to be born. Upon escaping Yomi, Izanagi performed a purification ritual to cleanse himself of death and defilement. As he washed his body, more gods were born. From the washing of his left eye came Amaterasu, the goddess of the sun, radiant and golden. From his right eye came Tsukuyomi, the god of the moon, serene and distant. And from his nose came Susanoo, the god of storms and seas, wild, uncontrollable, and proud. These three deities were not ordinary siblings. They were destined to rule over the sky, the night, and the depths of the oceans. Amaterasu, with her dazzling brilliance, was given the high plane of heaven to illuminate the world and govern over the celestial realm. Tsukuyomi, cold and pale, was given dominion over the moon and night, and Susanoo, fierce and passionate, was tasked with ruling the ever-changing seas. From the union of divine beings and cosmic sorrow, from love and death, order and chaos, came the children who would shape the fate of heaven and earth. Amaterasu, the brightest of them all, would one day bring her light to the world, and just as suddenly one day take it away, leaving everything in Chiugo. But that part of the tale is yet to unfold. For now we rest in the glow of creation, in a time when the gods still walked the land, and the world was young. Amaterasu was not born in pain or sorrow like many other gods. She emerged during a sacred act of purification, a ritual of renewal and rebirth, performed by her father, Izanagi. After escaping from the land of death, stained by the shadows of Yomi and haunted by the memory of his beloved Izanami's decaying form, Izanagi sought to cleanse himself of the impurity clinging to his divine essence. He bathed in a sacred river, washing away the filth of the underworld, and as each part of his body met the water, new deities were born. And then, as he rinsed his left eye, light itself emerged. Amaterasu Omikami, the great august deity who shines in heaven, was born from that moment of light touching water. The sky grew brighter, and a gentle warmth spread across the land. It is said the heavens themselves paused in reverence. She did not cry, nor scream, nor hide. She radiated with a brilliance so profound that even the other gods turned their gaze downward, humbled by her glow. Her hair shimmered like spun sunlight, her voice calmed like dawn breaking across distant hills, and her presence brought peace. From the moment of her birth, Amaterasu was different. She was not a goddess of war or of vengeance, but of balance, harmony, and continuity. Yet within her serenity burned a powerful energy, the same fire that lights the sun, fierce and life-giving. She was appointed by Izanagi to ascend to Takamagahara, the high plane of heaven, and to reign over the celestial domain. Her role was to illuminate both the realm of the gods and the mortal world below, to bring rhythm to day and night, and to mark the seasons with her journey across the sky. The chariot she rode was made of gold and pulled by divine horses, their hooves never touching earth, their breath like warm spring winds. As she made her daily journey from the east to the west, the world bloomed beneath her. Rice fields ripened, rivers sparkled, cherry trees blushed with colour. The people of the earth lifted their faces toward the sky, not in fear, but in gratitude. She became more than a goddess. She became life itself. Temples were erected in her honour, the most sacred being the Ice Grand Shrine, hidden deep in the forests of Japan. There, even to this day, her spirit is enshrined and honoured, with rituals performed by high priestesses, many of whom have descended from Japan's imperial family, who claim Amaterasu as their divine ancestor. But Amaterasu was not only worshipped, she was also watched, for her light was not guaranteed. As with all things divine, there were conditions, limits, vulnerabilities. She was a goddess, yes, but not without emotion, not without the capacity to be wounded. And it is this very balance, her capacity to shine and her capacity to hide, that made her beloved by mortals and feared by gods. In the heavens, Amaterasu was admired but also envied. She carried herself with quiet authority, but her siblings often stirred unrest. The moon god, Tsukuyomi, elegant and calm, kept his distance. The sea god, Susanoo, her youngest brother, burned with tempestuous energy. While Amaterasu created order, Susanoo created chaos. Where she cultivated rice fields, he ripped them from the earth. And though they were of the same divine blood, the tension between them grew with each passing day. Still, Amaterasu remained steady. She tended to the rice paddies of heaven, taught humans how to grow food, and brought wisdom and culture to the mortal world. Her followers looked to her not just as a source of light, but as a moral compass, a reminder that even divine power must be tempered with kindness, responsibility, and restraint. And so the sun rose and set by her will. The world turned gently in her glow. She watched over all, Yet she knew deep in the quiet chamber of her heart that not all would stay peaceful forever. For just as light cast shadows, her own brilliance would one day be dimmed, not by time nor by age, but by the breaking of trust. The seed of darkness had already been planted, and it lay waiting, growing beneath the golden field she nurtured. But until that day arrived, she reigned, alone in the sky, yet never unloved, pouring her golden light upon a grateful world. While Amaterasu radiated warmth, grace, and harmony, her younger brother Susanoo was a storm wrapped in flesh, a god of uncontrollable emotion and raw elemental force. From the moment of his divine birth, when Izanagi rinsed his nose in the sacred river, Susanoo emerged like a violent wind tearing through the stillness of dawn. Unlike Amaterasu's quiet brilliance, Susanoo was thunderous, impulsive, and passionate. The heavens trembled with his cries before he had even spoken a word. Susanoo was not evil, but he was wild. His nature was as unpredictable as the seas he ruled, sometimes calm and mysterious, other times ferocious and devastating. He was the god of the ocean, of tempests, of chaos and mourning. And with these elements came emotional depth rarely seen in the kami. He was moved by grief, pride, jealousy, love, and rage, often all at once. As he grew older, Susanoo became increasingly restless. Though he had been entrusted with dominion over the seas, he did not find joy in his role. Instead, he mourned. His heart ached with longing for his mother, Izanami, who had perished in fire and vanished into the shadowy world of Yomi. He could not accept her death, nor forgive the laws that had torn them apart. In his anguish, Susanoo's power became unstable. Wherever he walked, crops failed, rivers flooded, and the skies darkened. The other gods began to fear him. Even the calmness of the high plane of heaven seemed to tremble under his footsteps. The world needed order, balance, predictability, but Susanoo brought none of these. He was a god of disruption, and that made him both dangerous and necessary. For creation itself requires not just light and warmth, but destruction to clear the path for rebirth. Yet despite his raw power, Susanoo's heart still longed for connection. He looked to his sister Amaterasu not just as a sibling, but as a rival, a mirror, and perhaps a light he could never quite reach. She had received the high plane of heaven. She was worshipped, revered, and crowned with golden honour. He had been cast down to rule over the oceans, vast and deep, yes, but cold and isolated. This imbalance, real or perceived, festered within him like a storm gathering over still waters. It was this deep sense of pain and injustice that eventually led Susanoo to act out in increasingly volatile ways. Rather than seek guidance, he challenged the gods. Rather than build, he tore down. His divine tantrums would often shake both the heavens and the earth, and with each one, the other deities grew more uneasy. At last, Susanoo approached Amaterasu in the high plane of heaven, not in peace but in fury. He demanded permission to bid her farewell before descending to the underworld to search for their mother. But Amaterasu, ever wise, saw through his words. She sensed the turbulence in his heart. His steps were too heavy, his breath too quick, his voice too sharp. She did not trust him, and yet a part of her still hoped. Hope that her brother might find redemption, or perhaps stillness, through some divine bond between them. So in an effort to determine his true intentions, she challenged him to a sacred ritual, a test of truth. They would each take a sacred object from the other, break it apart, and from its pieces give birth to divine beings. If the resulting children were pure and good, it would prove the purity of the other's heart. Amaterasu took Susanoo's sword, long, curved, and heavy with the weight of war, and broke it into 3. As she chewed its fragments and spat them into the air, 3 radiant goddesses were born, their presence gentle and glowing. Then Susanoo took her necklace of 8 jewels and crushed it between his teeth. From its pieces, 5 male gods burst forth, fiery and bold. He claimed victory, arguing that because the gods were male and had come from her necklace, they were his. But Amaterasu reminded him that the lineage of the gods comes not from the origin of the object, but from the one who gave birth to them. She had given birth to his goddesses. He had given birth to her gods. She therefore had proven her purity. Susanoo, frustrated and humiliated, could not contain himself. His rage boiled over, the clouds darkened, the winds howled, and his actions would soon plunge the heavens into fear. But even in his most destructive moments, Susanoo was not without depth. He represented the part of the cosmos, and the human soul that rebels, that questions, that aches for something just out of reach. He was the ocean after all. Powerful, necessary, and ultimately unknowable. He was not just a destroyer, but a test of the gods, of order, of light itself. And in time his storm would crash against the serene sky of Amaterasu's world, leaving both of them changed forever. The tension between Amaterasu and Susanoo was no longer a quiet discomfort held behind divine politeness. It had become a pressure in the air, like the stillness before a thunderstorm. Though they were siblings and children of the same creator, the gap between them was vast, as if they lived in different seasons of the world. Amaterasu governed with calm dignity, her light sustaining crops and guiding humanity. Susanoo, by contrast, was chaos incarnate, his storms devouring the skies, his emotions erupting like tidal wave crashing through still waters. When Susanoo arrived at the gates of Takamagahara, the heavenly realm, his presence was not unnoticed. The wind stirred uneasily, birds flew in erratic spirals, even the leaves on the sacred trees seemed to shiver. Amaterasu sensed his approach long before he stood before her. She looked down from her celestial palace and watched his figure drawing closer, a god cloaked in power, bitterness trailing behind him like a storm cloud. Susanoo announced his intent. He claimed he had come not to wage war or cause mischief, but to bid farewell. He declared that he was preparing to descend into Yomi, the shadowy underworld, in search of their mother, Izanami. He spoke of grief, of longing, of a heart that could not find peace without her. But Amaterasu did not trust words alone. Her brother's past was littered with broken promises and unprovoked rages. His voice trembled with passion, yes, but also with the volatile energy of deception. She studied him in silence, her golden eyes reflecting more than sunlight. They reflected memory. She remembered the way he had stirred up storms for amusement, frightened lesser kami, torn apart the sacred lands. And yet, he was her brother, a god of immense potential. Perhaps, just perhaps, he could still be reasoned with. But she would not rely on trust alone. Amaterasu, wise in the ways of spirit and ceremony, proposed a test, a ritual contest of purity and sincerity. She knew that words could lie, but sacred rites revealed the truth behind intent. She and Susanoo would engage in a symbolic act of creation. Each would take a sacred object belonging to the other and transform it into new life. This, she believed, would reveal the true nature of their hearts. For the gods that were born from this exchange would carry the spiritual residue of their creator's essence. Were they pure, radiant beings, or shadowed, violent ones? Susanoo agreed, his voice thick with pride. He handed Amaterasu his great sword, a mighty weapon forged from divine steel, soaked in battles both earthly and celestial. Amaterasu received it with calm reverence. She broke the blade into 3 pieces, placed them in her mouth, and chewed slowly, ritually. She did not rush. She allowed the sacred metal to mingle with her breath and spirit. When she spat the fragments into the air, they shimmered and rose into the heavens, where 3 graceful goddesses were born, their presence radiant and peaceful. The air grew warm, flowers opened, the heavenly plain was still once more. Then it was Susanoo's turn. Amaterasu removed her 8-petaled necklace, an object of deep beauty and sacred significance, a symbol of celestial authority and harmony, and gave it to Susanoo. He took it in his hand, lifted it to his mouth, and crushed it between his teeth with defiant energy. From the broken jewels and his divine breath, 5 male kami burst forth, strong, loud, full of fiery power. The sky briefly darkened, then pulsed with flashes of light as these gods took form. Susanoo laughed with pride. He declared that because the gods were male, they were his sons and proof of his virtue. But Amaterasu was not swayed. She reminded him that it was not the object's origin that defined the purity of the act, but the one who gave it life. He had created these gods from her necklace. They were her creations, and thus the light of sincerity lay with her. This subtle correction, though calm in tone, humiliated Susanoo. The laughter that had filled his chest soured into resentment. He felt dismissed, reduced, once again overshadowed by his sister's wisdom. In his heart, envy festered. His emotions, always intense, twisted into something more destructive. He could not bear to be outshone. The god of storms felt small in the presence of the sun. What followed was not a sudden explosion of violence, but a slow unravelling of restraint. Susanoo's jealousy curdled into mischief. He began to act not with reason, but with impulse, driven by an emotional typhoon spinning out of control. The contest had been sacred, and Amaterasu had offered it as a bridge between them, but to Susanoo it now felt like a stage on which he had been ridiculed. As the days passed, Susanoo's behaviour worsened. He rampaged through the heavenly plains. He trampled the rice fields Amaterasu had so carefully planted. He defecated in the sacred halls. He tore the boundaries between beauty and chaos, each act more vulgar than the last, more infused with symbolic hatred for his sister's order and peace. And all the while Amaterasu watched. She did not confront him immediately. Perhaps she hoped he would stop. Perhaps she feared that reacting too strongly would feed his fury. But then came the act that shattered everything. In a moment of cruel mockery, Susanoo took a flayed horse, an animal sacred to the heavens, and hurled its bloody body into Amaterasu's weaving hall, crashing through the roof and terrifying her handmaidens. One of them died in horror and grief. The sanctity of the place, the still-woven harmony of creation, was shattered. It was no longer a matter of rivalry or disrespect. It was sacrilege. Amaterasu, who had endured so much, finally broke. She turned away, without a word, without a cry. She left her throne and stepped down from the heavenly palace. She made her way to a hidden place, the sacred cave known as Amano Iwato, and disappeared into its cold Darthinir's dark mouth. She sealed the entrance with a massive stone and vanished from the world. And with her, the light of the sun was gone. The sacred contest between Amaterasu and Susanoo had begun with ceremony and hope, a moment where the bonds of divine siblinghood might have been restored. But rituals, however ancient and holy, cannot alone heal a wounded heart. Beneath the surface of formality, resentment boiled. Susanoo, whose turbulent emotions matched the oceans he ruled, could not accept what he saw as another public humiliation. Amaterasu had followed every rite perfectly, her goddesses glowing with peace and light. When she reminded Susanoo that the 5 gods he created were not his sons but hers, since he had used her necklace, he felt not corrected, but defeated. In the heavens, where honour carried the weight of mountains, this subtle redirection stung like a blade. Susanoo's pride, already brittle, shattered. He may have come to the high plane of heaven, with grief and longing in his heart, but now those emotions were devoured by fury, jealousy, and something deeper, shame. And so the contest of creation ended not with joy or harmony, but with the quiet ignition of a divine storm. Susanoo began to unravel. At first, it was small acts the other gods observed but dared not confront. He walked through Amaterasu's carefully cultivated rice fields and crushed the stalks beneath his feet. He uprooted the tender shoots with no thought for the seasons, leaving the fields desolate and broken. These were not just fields, but sacred places where the food of the gods was grown, symbols of life and divine order. In destroying them, Susanoo sent a message. He would not be the lesser. If he could not create as she did, then he would destroy. Next came the sacred halls, structures made with celestial care, where the kami gathered to govern and hold court. Susanoo defiled them. He smeared filth across the polished floors, made obscene noises during sacred ceremonies, and violated the quiet dignity that defined the high plane of heaven. The lesser gods began to flee from him, hiding behind sacred trees, whispering among themselves in fear. Still, Amaterasu held her silence, not because she was weak, but because she believed in the power of patience, in the possibility that her brother would see the ruin he was causing and turn back. She gave him space to calm. She offered, through her silence, a chance for redemption, but her silence was mistaken for weakness, her restraint seen as indifference, and Susanoo, swept away by the storm within him, only escalated further. The final act, the one that broke the heavens, took place in her sacred weaving hall, a place where sunlight and thread met in a dance of creation. The weaving hall was no ordinary structure. It was the heart of Amaterasu's divine art, where she and her maidens spun garments for the gods and banners for the heavens. Each strand of thread represented continuity, balance, and care, woven with breath, spirit, and silence. No loud voices were heard there, only the sound of the loom, the movement of hands, the whisper of prayer. Into this sacred space Susanoo hurled death. He found a celestial horse, white and pure, a creature sacred to Amaterasu and beloved in the eyes of the gods. He flayed it, stripped it of its skin while it still lived, and hurled its bleeding body into the ceiling of the weaving hall. It came crashing down in a cascade of blood and bone. The maidens, startled and horrified, screamed. One fell upon her loom and died, pierced by her own shuttle. The silence of the weaving hall was destroyed, the sanctity of creation defiled. And Amaterasu, whose heart had already endured so much, could endure no more. She did not scream, she did not curse, and she did not punish. She disappeared. Leaving the horror behind her, Amaterasu walked away, not just from the weaving hall, but from the heavens themselves. She made her way to the Amano Iwato, the heavenly rock cave, nestled in the side of a sacred mountain. No god dared follow her. No light marked her path. She reached the mouth of the cave, pulled a massive stone before the entrance and sealed herself inside. She, the sun goddess, retreated into the shadow. The moment the cave closed, the light vanished from the world. The sky went dim, a cold twilight fell across the land and the heavens. Without Amaterasu there was no sunrise, no warmth, no rhythm. Crops stopped growing. Mortals panicked. Demons and dark spirits, once banished by her radiant presence, began to crawl forth from the shadows. The other kami, stunned and helpless, stood in silence, unsure what to do. The celestial world, once bright with harmony and golden warmth, now trembled beneath a quiet, growing fear. Time slowed. The stars seemed to flicker uncertainly in the dark. Susanoo, once burning with rage, now stood alone, staring at the sealed cave, realizing what he had done. But the door would not open. The world was broken. What had begun as a contest to reveal purity had now revealed something far more dangerous. What happens when pride meets patience, when light meets its opposite, not in battle, but in sorrow. And with the sun hidden, the world waited in silence, hoping that the gods could find a way to bring back the light. The sun had vanished. The high plane of heaven, once golden and alive with the light of Amaterasu, now lay cloaked in a deep, unnatural twilight. The air was colder, heavier. The celestial trees no longer swayed with joy, but stood stiff and silent, their leaves dulled without the shimmer of daylight. The other kami, gods and goddesses of the heavens, gathered in scattered confusion, their voices hushed, their eyes turned toward the cave where Amaterasu had sealed herself away. It was a silence unlike any they had ever known. Not the silence of peace or rest, but of jade, like a held breath stretching endlessly, waiting for something, anything to break it. No songbirds greeted the morning, for there was no morning. No incense was offered in temples, for no rituals were complete without the sun's gaze. And across the human world below, people lived in fear. Crops failed without sunlight, rivers froze, animals grew restless, children cried in the night. Without Amaterasu, the world began to unravel. Within the sealed cave, Amaterasu sat alone, surrounded by absolute darkness. For the first time since her birth, she no longer emitted light. Her radiance, which had poured from her like a never-ending sunrise, now lay dormant, folded into herself like a dying flame. She did not rage. She did not cry. She simply existed in the stillness, her divine sorrow too heavy for words. She had not gone into hiding to punish the world. She had gone because her heart was broken, her weaving hall desecrated, her maidens dead, her brother lost to madness. To Amaterasu, the world no longer felt safe. It no longer felt worthy of light. Outside the cave, the other gods and goddesses convened in desperate urgency. It became clear to them that something had to be done. The world could not survive without the sun. But no force, no divine strength could move the massive stone that sealed the cave. It was not a physical barrier alone, it was also symbolic. It represented Amaterasu's choice, her agency, her decision to retreat, and that meant brute force would not bring her back. So the gods began to argue. Some blamed Susnu and demanded his exile. Others called for rituals to beg for Amaterasu's forgiveness. But one goddess did not speak at first. She simply observed. Her name was Ame no Uzume, the goddess of dawn, of laughter, and of joyful rebellion. She was not the most powerful deity, nor the most respected, but she held a unique wisdom. She understood the heart. Ame no Uzume stepped forward and addressed the gathered kami. "If we want the sun to return," she said, "we must remind her that the world is still capable of joy." The gods looked at her with confusion. Joy in this darkness? But she continued. "If we beg, she will hear only guilt. If we force the cave open, she will see it as another violation. But if we laugh, if we dance, if we celebrate her light, she may grow curious, and curiosity is the beginning of return." The plan was simple and bold. The gods gathered outside the cave. They prepared a sacred stage, a flat stone turned upside down, used as a drum. They adorned it with jewels, garlands, and the tools of ritual. Around it they hung a mirror from a sakaki tree, and strings of white cloth fluttered in the windless air. It was not a weapon or a plea, it was a celebration waiting to happen. Then Ame no Uzume stepped forward. She wore no grand robes, no crown. Instead, she wore her own laughter like a garment. Slowly she climbed atop the overturned tub and began to dance. But this was not a graceful, elegant dance of courtly tradition. It was wild, unrestrained, and full of mischief. She stomped, she spat, she beat her feet against the drum, she shook her body in exaggerated, hilarious gestures, and as she danced, her clothes began to slip, revealing more than propriety allowed. The gods gasped, and then they laughed. Not just small, nervous laughs, but deep, thunderous belly laughs. Laughter that echoed through the dark sky, laughter that rumbled like distant thunder. It was uncontrollable, infectious. Even the trees seemed to lean in, curious. The sound of joy, so rare, so bold, spread through the heavens like a song long forgotten. Inside the cave, Amaterasu heard it. She froze. For so long she had believed that the world outside was as broken as her heart. But now she heard music, celebration, laughter. Not mourning or shame, but something alive, something unexpected, something beautiful. She leaned closer to the entrance, curiosity flickering for the first time like the smallest ember. Slowly, silently, she cracked open the stone just enough to peer out. And there, hanging from the sacred tree, she saw the Yata no Kagami, a brilliant bronze mirror, polished to perfect clarity. In its surface she saw her own reflection. She had never seen herself before, and what she saw startled her. She was radiant, majestic, wounded, yes, but powerful. Her golden hair, her luminous eyes, the divine light that still pulsed within her. It had not died. It had only been hidden. The gods were ready. As she stepped forward, drawn by the mirror and the joyous noise, two strong deities, Ame no Tajikarao and Futodama, moved swiftly. They grasped the great stone and rolled it away. They placed a rope behind her, a shimenawa, a sacred boundary, to prevent her from ever returning to the darkness. And just like that, the cave was open. Amaterasu stood blinking in the new light. Not sunlight, but the light of community, of divine joy, of hope, and slowly, ever so gently, her inner radiance began to return. The skies brightened, warmth returned to the air, the birds sang again. On earth, people emerged from their homes, feeling the touch of the sun on their skin once more, and all of heaven breathed out in relief. It had not been force or fear that brought the sun back. It had been laughter, celebration, and the remembrance that even in sorrow the world is still worthy of light. But though the sun had returned, the heavens would not forget what had happened. A reckoning was still to come. Susanoo, whose actions had plunged the world into darkness, would now face the judgment of the gods, but for now the light had returned, and the world, wounded but alive, turned once more. The moment Amaterasu vanished into the cave, the entire world was thrown into a strange, breathless suspension. The sun, once a dependable presence in the sky, simply stopped rising. There was no dawn, no twilight, no noon, only an endless grey gloom that thickened into pitch-black night, a night that did not sleep but lingered, watching. For the first time since creation, the world lost its rhythm. Life, which had pulsed to the steady beat of sunrise and sunset, now floated in uncertainty. In the heavens, panic spread like wildfire. The gods, who had never known darkness, were stunned into silence. Their once glorious palaces, gilded with sunlight and lit by sacred fires, now stood cold and lifeless. Sacred ceremonies were abandoned. Ritual chants fell flat. Even the divine trees that had sung in the wind fell mute, their leaves unmoving. The heavens themselves seemed to mourn. But it was in the earthly realm that the consequences were truly felt. Without the sun, the seasons began to unravel. Crops failed to sprout. Trees dropped their leaves prematurely. Animals, confused by the perpetual night, wandered from their territories in desperation. Wolves howled through dark forests with no moon to guide them. The rivers ran slower and colder, and the air turned sharp and brittle. The people looked to the sky and saw nothing. Not even stars dared to shine in the absence of Amaterasu. The darkness was not just physical, it was spiritual. Without the light of the sun goddess, something ancient and dangerous stirred in the corners of existence. Evil spirits, long suppressed by her brilliance, began to rise from shadowy places. In Shinto belief, light is a purifier, a ward against corruption. Now, that purifying force was gone. The only demonic spirits that thrived in chaos crept back into the world. Where once they had slithered through cracks in the human heart, they now roamed openly. Families began to suffer strange misfortunes. Illnesses spread without cause. Infants cried endlessly. People whispered of curses, of ghosts lurking just beyond the lamplight. And still the sun did not return. The kami, Amaterasu's fellow gods, held council in the darkness. They gathered at the Amane Yasukawara, a rocky field near the mouth of the cave where she now hid. Even their divine voices sounded thin against the weight of the silence. No one spoke first. They all looked at one another, hoping that someone, anyone, would know how to restore balance. But how do you call back the sun when she has hidden her heart from the world? Among them, anger flared. Some deities raged at Susnu's cruelty and demanded he be banished at once. Others cautioned restraint, knowing his power over the seas could not be cast away lightly. Still others simply wept, not knowing what to do. The world had not seen such sorrow since the death of Izanami. But even as chaos spread, one truth was clear. Amaterasu had not simply fled. She had withdrawn. That distinction mattered. She had not vanished out of spite. She had retreated because her sacred space had been violated, her trust shattered. Her weaving hall, a temple of creation, had been turned into a stage of death. Her sacred maidens had perished in fear. Her brother, once a child of the same divine lineage, had mocked everything she stood for, and so she had removed herself from the world, not as punishment, but as grief. She had become a sun with no sky to shine upon. Inside the cave she did not sleep, she did not rage, she sat in stillness, wrapped in shadow, the once glorious light of her spirit pulled inward like a wounded flame. She was no longer the blazing goddess of the sky. She had become a hidden ember, glowing faintly, slowly fading beneath layers of sorrow. The stone at the cave's entrance was not just a physical barrier, it was her final word, her refusal to be exposed to pain again. Outside, the gods watched, helpless. The cave Amano Iwato was not merely a hiding place, it was a sacred threshold, a space between worlds. It existed within the folds of the heavenly realm but touched the darkness of Yomi. It was said to echo the underworld itself, where life and death meet, where gods question themselves. Amaterasu had chosen it precisely because it was a place where even light could disappear. And so time stood still. The mortal world, now caught in endless twilight, began to fracture. Civilizations that once danced to the cycle of day and night grew erratic. Festivals were cancelled. Prayers ceased. Without the sun, there was no calendar, no schedule, no hope. People huddled around dim fires, clinging to ancient songs and stories that once celebrated the sun. Now those stories felt like distant dreams, fragments of a forgotten truth, but not all despaired. In some corners of the world, people lit their own small fires. They gathered together in circles and spoke softly of the days when warmth still visited the earth. They told stories of Amaterasu, of her beauty, her kindness, and her gifts. They passed these stories down to children, not as myth, but as a promise that she would return, that she must return, for without her, nothing could truly live. And in the heavens, as the gods pondered what must be done, one among them began to step forward, not with force, but with the joy. Ame no Uzume, the goddess of laughter and dawn, began to prepare, not for war, not for punishment, but for celebration. Because she understood something the others had forgotten in their grief. You cannot pull light from darkness by force. You must entice it, welcome it, remind it of its own beauty. Amaterasu, the sun herself, had not died. She had only hidden her light and waited to see if the world would remember why it needed her. The world waited in quiet agony. Above, the high plane of heaven remained shrouded in darkness, a place once filled with golden light, now dim and colourless. Below, the earth drifted further into sorrow. Rivers no longer sparkled, trees did not bud. No songbirds chirped at dawn, for dawn had forgotten to arrive. Amaterasu remained sealed inside the cave, and the sun remained captive within her heart. The gods, though immortal and powerful, had grown uncertain. Their ceremonies were failing, their authority slipping. The sacred balance of all the things teetered on the edge. But while most gods mourned or raged, Ame no Uzume, the goddess of mirth, laughter, and joyful rebellion, watched with clear and clever eyes. Unlike many deities, she understood that the soul cannot be commanded, it must be coaxed. She saw what others could not. Amaterasu had not been defeated. She had withdrawn, hurt, humiliated, and uncertain whether her light was still welcome in a world where it had been mocked and defiled. Uzumi saw that the solution was not to pull the rock away or to shout apologies into the cave. What was needed was to change the atmosphere, to remind Amaterasu that joy still existed outside, that there were gods who still loved her, people who still needed her, and beauty in the world still worthy of her light. And so Uzumi devised a plan, not of strength, but of spirit. She called the gods together at the mouth of Amano Iwato, the sacred cave where Amaterasu had taken refuge. There, she asked for their help in creating a performance, a celebration, not of mourning, but of life. Some gods hesitated. How could they celebrate when the world was dying? But Uzumi insisted, what if the world is dying because we forgot how to celebrate? Slowly, they gathered what they could. A smooth stone tub was flipped over and placed like a makeshift stage. Divine jewels were hung from sakaki trees, sacred branches that served as bridges between the spiritual and physical worlds. White ritual cloths, known as shide, were strung between the branches, fluttering softly in the still air. And at the heart of it all, they placed a brilliant bronze mirror, the Yata no Kagami, polished to such perfection that it could reflect the soul of the one who gazed upon it. It was a mirror not just of face, but of essence. The gods assembled in a wide circle, holding out their breath as Uzumi stepped forward. She wore no crown, no golden robe, only a simple sash tied tightly at the waist, adorned with bells that jingled softly with each movement. Her face was painted with exaggerated joy, her eyes glowing with mischief. Then, in the silence before performance, she bowed once toward the cave and began her dance. At first it was slow and strange. She swayed and hummed, her arms lifting like petals in the wind. The gods watched in quiet confusion. But then the rhythm changed. Uzumi stomped her feet on the upturned tub, turning it into a drum. She spun in tight, dizzying circles. She howled with laughter and shook her hips with wild abandon. Her movements were playful, crude, defiant, filled with the kind of sacred irreverence that strips away sorrow and forces the spirit to feel again. Her bells rang out. Her bare feet slapped the drum. Her robe slipped from her shoulders. The gods gasped, then burst into laughter. It was spontaneous, raw, real, the first laughter since the sun had vanished. It echoed off the cave walls and danced into the sky like rising smoke. Even the birds, long silent, flapped their wings in surprise. Inside the cave, Amaterasu heard it, the laughter, the music, the bells. It was impossible to ignore. She had expected silence, guilt, perhaps weeping. But this was something else. Curiosity flickered within her like a spark. Had the world moved on? Were they mocking her? Or had they remembered joy? Had they remembered her? She crept closer to the stone door and leaned her golden ear to the crack. She heard clapping, stomping, singing, and then something more, her name chanted in rhythm, as if being invoked not in anger or desperation, but in welcome. Her fingers reached out and, with a quiet motion, pulled the stone back just enough to allow a sliver of light to peek out. And in that moment, the gods were ready. Ameno Tajikarawo, the god of strength, had been hiding beside the door, muscles tensed like a coiled spring. As soon as the gap appeared, he seized the stone and yanked it away, revealing Amaterasu in her full but dimmed brilliance. Futadama, the god of ritual, stepped forward and quickly strung a shimenawa, a sacred rope of twisted straw, behind her. It was not a trap, but a sign, a line that marked the end of her hiding. She could never again return to the cave, not because she was forbidden, but because she was needed. Amaterasu blinked. The light outside startled her. Not sunlight. Her own radiance had not yet returned, but the light of hope, of celebration, of love. She looked up and saw the mirror hanging from the tree, and there, for the first time in her eternal life, she saw herself. Not through the eyes of others, not as the object of worship, but as she truly was, And what she saw was not just beauty or divinity. She saw pain and strength and light, still burning even after all that had happened. Her light had not been taken. It had merely been waiting for a reason to return. With a breath like a summer wind, she stepped out of the cave fully. Her presence illuminated the field, igniting the jewels, the white paper streamers, the laughter of the gods. The skies began to clear. Warmth spread through the heavens. Down below, on earth, the first beams of sunlight broke over the mountains. People raised their eyes in wonder as golden light kissed their faces once more. The celebration did not end there. The gods gathered around Amaterasu, not to lecture, not to demand, but to honour. They bowed, they sang, they shared sake, and for the first time in what felt like eternity, the heavenly realm pulsed with harmony once more. It had not been a sword that opened the cave. It had not been anger, fear, or force. It was laughter, celebration, a goddess dancing half-naked on a drum. It was a reminder that joy is sacred, that even in the deepest darkness, the soul responds to love more than control. And Amaterasu, goddess of the sun, knew in her heart that the world was not yet lost. There was still something worth shining for, and so she did. Amaterasu stood at the mouth of the cave, blinking against the strange, unfamiliar sensation of light. Her own light, stretching out into a world she had not seen in what felt like an eternity. The gods stood still, watching her in reverent silence, not daring to speak, afraid even their breath might frighten her back into the shadows. Her gaze moved from the mirror hanging in the sakaki tree to the faces of the gods, many tearful, some joyful, all full of longing. She had not been forgotten. Her absence had not been filled. She had been missed, needed, loved. Her radiance, once dimmed by sorrow, began to pulse softly, as if the very cells of her being were remembering who she truly was. At first, her glow was like the light of a candle, flickering, unsure. But the more she stood among her fellow deities, the stronger it grew. The warmth returned to her skin. Her eyes no longer shimmered with tears, but with awakening. Slowly her light filled the heavens, not as a burst, but as a rising sun. The gods wept in quiet relief. They bowed low, offering their gratitude not through words, but through presence. None dared overwhelm her. Even Susanoo, far off in shame and isolation, felt the return of her light and knew that something profound had changed. Amaterasu was back, but not the same Amaterasu who had once ruled the sky without question. This Amaterasu had been wounded, had hidden, had faced her deepest sorrow, and emerged with greater strength. She was not just the sun goddess, she was the soul of the world reborn. The sky began to open, clouds parted, the celestial wind stirred, warm and fragrant, brushing against the cheeks of the gods. Flowers, celestial blossoms that had remained curled in darkness, began to bloom. Their petals shimmered with hues unseen for ages. Birds, once silent, returned with tentative songs, filling the air with melodies of new beginnings. Down on earth, the effect was immediate. People stepped out of their homes, shielding their eyes. The grey, relentless gloom began to lift. A single beam of golden light pierced the horizon like an arrow of hope. The chill that had settled in bones and hearts alike melted into warmth. Seeds that had lain dormant for weeks began to stir in the soil. Trees, long still, whispered again in the breeze. Even the animals seemed to rejoice. Deer bounded through forests, cranes took flight. Frogs croaked in joy from rice paddies that were once dry and cracking. Children pointed to the sky in wonder. The sun had returned. But this was not a simple restoration. It was a transformation. The world, having known darkness, now knew the true value of light. Where once sunrise had been expected, it was now a gift. Every new dawn would carry the weight of that absence, and the sacred knowledge that light is not guaranteed, not owed, it is offered and must be honoured. Back in Takamagahara, the high plane of heaven, Amaterasu was gently welcomed back to her celestial palace. But the rituals were different now. There was no triumph, no parade of superiority. The gods understood that what had happened was not a lesson in power, but in vulnerability. A goddess had been wounded, and her healing had healed the world. In honor of her return, the gods declared that the sacred mirror Yatanokagami would forever be kept as a symbol of Amaterasu's reflection. It was not simply a mirror of vanity, it was a mirror of truth, showing the divine within the self. It was placed, along with a sacred jewel and the legendary sword, in safekeeping as part of the imperial regalia of Japan, 3 treasures that symbolized not just power, but wisdom, compassion, and light born from struggle. The mirror to remember self-knowledge, the jewel to remember divine harmony, the sword to remember the trials that purify strength. These sacred objects would come to define the spiritual legacy of Amaterasu. They were not tokens of conquest, but relics of restoration, and they were entrusted to the mortal realm through the imperial family, who claimed descent from Amaterasu herself. Through this lineage, the sun goddess would continue to guide humanity, not as a distant deity, but as an ancestral spirit watching over the land she had once abandoned, but never stopped loving. As Amaterasu resumed her place in the sky, her journey across the heavens took on new meaning. She no longer merely illuminated the world, she bore witness to it. Every morning she rose, she reminded both gods and mortals that light must be protected, not taken for granted. And every evening she set, she whispered a promise, "I will return." The gods returned to their rituals, but now with deeper reverence. The festivals in her honor, such as the great ceremonies held at the Isgran Shrine, were no longer just celebrations of her power. They were acknowledgements of her pain, her courage, her sacrifice. The priests and priestesses who served her carried not just incense and offerings, but stories of the time the sun left and what it took to bring her back. Amaterasu's presence was different now. She was no longer just the source of light, she was the symbol of endurance, the embodiment of healing, a reminder that even the brightest beings can falter, can feel sorrow, can hide and still rise again. And so the heavens once again pulsed with life. The fields grew, the seasons resumed their sacred rhythm. The ocean, ruled by Susanoo, calmed, for even he in exile had felt the weight of his actions. Redemption perhaps would come later, but for now peace had returned. And high above, in her golden chariot drawn by celestial steeds, Amaterasu began her journey across the sky once more, not as a goddess who had never fallen, but as one who had and risen brighter because of it. The sun had returned to the world, but it had not returned unchanged, nor had the world remained the same. The absence of Amaterasu had carved a scar into both the heavens and the earth, a silent reminder that even the most luminous divine presence could falter, withdraw, and disappear. But from that darkness had come wisdom, not just for the gods, but for all of creation. And in that wisdom, something new was born. A reverence deeper than worship, a bond deeper than power, a legacy. After Amaterasu's return, the heavens did not erupt into wild jubilation. There were no celestial parades or victory feasts. Instead, there was a profound, almost sacred quiet, a peace that comes not from conquest, but from the mending of something fragile. Amaterasu's light was gentle in those early days, not blinding or overwhelming. It spilled softly over the mountains and forests, brushed the tips of trees, kissed the faces of those who had waited so long in darkness. The gods understood now that light was not a guarantee, that Amaterasu, though a goddess, was not an unfeeling force but a being of deep emotion, capable of sorrow, retreat, and healing. They had seen her hurt, they had witnessed her return, and so they treated her presence with a reverence that was no longer based on her power alone, but on the journey she had undertaken to reclaim herself. In the years that followed, the tale of Amaterasu's retreat into the cave and her eventual emergence became one of the most sacred myths in all of Shinto tradition. It was not merely a story about the sun or about the feud between siblings. It was a myth of cosmic balance, a spiritual teaching, a mirror held up to the human heart. In the land of mortals, generations passed down the story with care and devotion. Children were taught not only that the sun gave life, but that the sun once left, and the world had to earn a return. Temples and shrines were built, the most sacred among them being the Ice-Grand Shrine in what is now Mi Prefecture. There, under towering cypress trees, Amaterasu was honoured not with statues. She was never depicted in form, but with open space with sunlight pouring into an unadorned wooden sanctuary. The shrine, rebuilt every 20 years in a ritual known as Shikinen Sengu, symbolized renewal, the understanding that everything, even the most sacred, must be refreshed, reborn, and cared for. That continuity is not the absence of change, but the act of rebuilding in honor of what was lost and found again. Amaterasu's story did not remain only among the gods. It became the spiritual bedrock of the Japanese imperial line. According to tradition, her great-grandson, Ninigi no Mikoto, descended from the heavens to earth, bearing with him the three sacred treasures of the gods, the mirror, the jewel, and the sword. These were not mere objects, but living symbols of Amaterasu's experience. The mirror was the Yata no Kagami, the same one that had lured her from the cave, the one in which she had seen herself for the first time, not as the goddess others perceived her to be, but as she truly was. The mirror became a reminder that self-knowledge is sacred, that even divine beings must pause to reflect on who they are. The jewel, the Yasakani no Magatama, symbolized harmony and connection. It was an object of great spiritual resonance, representing the bonds between gods and humans, between heaven and earth. It reminded all who saw it that the world is held together not by force, but by shared essence and interdependence. The sword, the Kusanagi no Tsurugi, forged through trials and turmoil, stood for courage and the ability to overcome darkness. Though it was associated with Susanoo, who had slain the eight-headed serpent and retrieved it from the beast's tail, it now became part of Amaterasu's regalia, a reminder that even chaos could be transformed into a force of protection and strength. Together, these three treasures formed the spiritual and political legitimacy of the Japanese emperor, who was seen not merely as a ruler but as a living descendant of Amaterasu. The emperor's role, especially in ancient times, was to act as an intermediary between heaven and earth, to protect harmony, to ensure the proper flow of life. But more than politics or royalty, the myth endured because it spoke to something universal. It told of a world that falls into darkness, not because evil conquers, but because the light retreats. It told of the pain that causes one to hide. It told of the strength it takes to return, and it told of the importance of community, not the kind that demands or punishes, but the kind that sings, dances, and laughs in welcome. The gods had not broken open the cave with lightning or rage. They had not commanded Amaterasu to return. They had invited her back with joy. They had reminded her that the world was still beautiful, still worthy, still full of beings who loved her, needed her, and would wait as long as it took. And so the legacy of Amaterasu lives on, not only in rituals and shrines, but in the first rays of sunlight that stream through the trees each morning, in the laughter that breaks sorrow's grip, in the warmth that returns after a long winter, in the quiet strength of those who emerge from darkness carrying their own light, reshaped, reborn, and radiant. Every sunrise is a retelling of her story, every new day is her legacy.